Hi, and welcome back to our Level 1 Felt Flower series. Today we'll be learning how to make the gathered rose. This is one of my favorites. It looks elegant with the thread. We gather it and yeah, so we'll start with materials. Today we will need a piece of felt that's going to be 12 by 6 inches, a pair of fabric shears, a ruler. I'm using an 18-inch ruler. And then thread that matches your felt and a needle. Today I'm using gray so that you guys can see me as I sew. And finally, a hot glue gun, making sure you have enough glue. So first we're gonna start with this template circle. I have about a 2 3/4 inch circle. And out of your felt, you're gonna wanna cut 8 circles. You can trace them if you prefer to do that, but for me, I just like to cut the fabric as I go and trim around the stencil. So here we have one circle. Your circles don't have to be perfectly trimmed, but you want them all to be roughly the same size. You can cut multiple circles at once if you would like, but I prefer to do one at a time because they turn out better and you don't get any sliding of the felt as you trim around, because sometimes your circles will be different sizes then. You can cut the circles different diameters, but just under 3 inches seems to be the best size for making wreaths. Any bigger and they kind of take over the whole wreath ring. And any smaller, they don't have the volume that a 3-inch circle has. So we're almost done cutting our petals. After the last one is trimmed, we're gonna cut the circles into 2 halves. So you'll have 2 semicircles. And the way I like to do this is by folding the circle in half and cutting along the folded edge. So you'll do that for all 8 of your circles. So instead of 8 petals, we'll have 16 petals. I think you really need at least 14 petals for the flower to look full enough. In the next step, we're going to thread our needle. I like to make a double thread. Your thread should be about 20 inches long. We'll put that through the eye, match the ends, and create a knot. You'll want to create probably a double knot just to make sure that your thread isn't slipping right through the felt. But I also have another tip for that too if you come across that. So now that our thread is tied, we're going to start sewing our petals together. So what we're going to start doing, each petal you'll go back and forth twice. So you're gonna start going down, up again. Pull it through, and just before it reaches to the end, you'll want to put a little bit of hot glue where the thread knot is, just to make sure it stays in place. So for each of the following petals, you'll place it about 2/3 of the way down and do 1 stitch to hold it in. And now we're going to do that for all 16 petals. And as you go, you'll kind of gather these petals by pulling the thread. We want to create a gathered look. It will make your flower look a lot more full, and the whole point of sewing this at all would be to gather it. If you don't want to gather it, you don't need to sew it, but for our purposes, you'll just keep going until you've used all of your petals. Just making sure as you go, you're gathering and pulling the thread so you create space for that next petal. And like I said in the beginning, you probably are going to want to use a thread that matches your flower just so it's concealed better, but either way, you won't really be able to see the thread unless you're looking really closely at your flower. Now once we get to the end, we're going to make sure that's nice and gathered, pulling our petals down. And we're gonna make a knot. And I like to do the same thing here, putting a touch of hot glue to make sure it stays. You can trim your needle off, and what you're left with is some gathered petals. So as you notice, I have one end that's not gathered. We're gonna begin with that end. You'll wanna kind of make sure your petals are all going the same direction because we're going to do the same technique and roll our flower up. So starting from the non-gathered end, we're gonna put hot glue. And you'll wanna roll it pretty tightly in on itself because this will be the very center of your flower. And then you'll just keep going along with the hot glue, doing small sections at a time, making sure the glue doesn't dry before you try rolling your flower up. The more gathered you make your flower, the more poof it will have, and I think it's more elegant looking. If you want it less gathered, it will end up with a wider diameter. So as we get to the end, same kind of issue here with any other flower is that you're wanting to put a lot of hot glue on that very edge piece because otherwise it might come unwound. And then I like to just kind of hold it and press the petals in to make sure there are no gaps from the front. You can also trim any long threads. Flip your flower, and I like to poof it out some. And there we have our gathered rows.